The northern cod, it's an iconic stock, certainly for Canada, and probably if you look worldwide, it's an iconic stock for several reasons. It played a really important part in the economic history of the North Atlantic. It really, I think Innes back in 1940 said it was the kind of spearhead for English and French, people call it invasion, but settlement in North America. So incredibly important despite the biology. A very large stock. This is where it lives on the yellow part of the continental shelf. It stretches from all the way down from 200 miles, about 200 and a bit more miles offshore. A huge area of continental shelf, way up to Labrador. The Grand Banks, of course, are unique, almost unique in the world. It's one of the only places where you can go 100 nautical miles offshore and have rocks breaking the surface. And 200 miles offshore, it's only 50 meters deep. So a really unique area, then a big fishery, as most of you know who are studying fisheries for a long, long time. The northern cod is one of several stocks and groups. Some of the delineations between populations, groups, and stocks in this area is not all that clear to me, even after all these years studying it. But certainly the northern, what we call the northern cod, and what's managed as a northern cod, was by far the biggest of all these stocks. Dwarfed, basically, all the others, even though the Grand Bank and St. Pierre Bank stocks, Gulf of St. Lawrence, and so on were important fisheries. They were small compared to the northern cod. This is what really drove settlement in Newfoundland and Labrador and a lot of other areas. I haven't mentioned to the south, but even down as far as Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts House of Assembly, they still have the sacred cod hanging as a representation of how important it was in history. Now, the abundance of this stock has been known for a long, long time, and there's quotes going back to, right back to John Cabot's day and some of the other famous explorers that came from Europe. But I always liked this kind of quote because it had a bit of a sense of humor. Newfoundlanders love senses of humor, and this one, because it says, "For though the British Channel and German Ocean, North Sea basically, are not without this fish, their numbers are so inconsiderable comparatively to those of Newfoundland, they may be rather looked upon as stragglers." So this is said by some fellow way back in the 1700s. So it's been recognized for a long, long time. Now, I can't go much into the oceanography and biology but I want to give you a little bit of a taste of it because I think some of the things are really important to acknowledge as we look at the more recent history of what's happened. If you see the blue line there on the shelf, that's the Labrador Current. It's a very, very cold water, freshwater current. It kind of dominates this area, and think of it like a conveyor belt going from north to south. Now this has a really important aspect to it when we talk about where cod are spawning, what's most important, where the eggs and larvae are likely to drift, because everything in this part of the world that's near the surface is going south. Everything. You can't go north unless you're a very strong swimmer and stay under it. And in fact, that's what the adult cod do, because the Labrador Current kind of looks like this if you look at a cross-section of the shelf. The blue represents sub-zero water, and some of those other lines that are out there, that's the average of what it looks like across the shelf. In some of the very cold years, like in the early 90s, that was way out, almost to the edge of the shelf. And really, the cod habitat, if you want to look at that, for most of the year is underneath that cold water. They don't live in that cold water. It's too cold and so on for them. It can get down to -2, which really hurts. And that water down below is Atlantic Ocean water, very different oceanographic properties, and is very favorable for cod, 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. So they live out there. Most of them spawn out there, although there is inshore spawning as well. And they also live on top of it, but right inshore. And that's where they come. They come for hundreds of years annually to feed. And the feed, of course, is Kaitlyn, and I'll say a bit about that in a minute. So how can we characterize these? I like to always try to characterize different ecosystems and fisheries because a lot of them are very different. So this is pretty general, but basically this part of the world it's a northern ecosystem, and it's characterized by very high biomass, or it did in the past at least. Very high biomass and high density. That is, things tend to be very highly aggregated in this ecosystem. Now, there are some species that are kind of universally spread out, but the main ones that we're talking about, and that would include others, but cod, Kaitlyn are the two ones that we'll concentrate on today, are very highly aggregated. And this has incredible impact on almost everything, certainly on the biology, but also on how do you measure them, how do you survey them, and how the fishery is prosecuted, and what the effect of the fishery has been in the past and in the present. This high aggregation, it's incredibly important. There are also very few species in this ecosystem. Really simple food webs compared to, say, tropical areas or areas that have got a lot of other pelagics and so on. The only really dominant pelagic is Kaitlyn. And it's as simple as that. And also, something that I've been working on lately, and I'll show you a slide of this in a minute, but these systems are not all that productive. They have basically a very low productivity compared to other ecosystems. But they're characterized by this very high biomass. I always kind of thought of them as kind of old growth forests. You know, you get huge biomass, but it doesn't turn over very quickly. Also, an incredibly important aspect that I think is very under-realized is about how you harvest, how you fish a system like this sustainably. And that, I think, has led us down the garden path in the past. And it's cold, of course. Newfoundland is a cold place. If you don't like cold, you probably won't like Newfoundland. Now, I wanted to just show you this, just as an example, when I talk about how aggregated cod can be. These are all echograms for those of you who know something about hydroacoustics. They're all echograms of cod schools. Some of the scales are not on here, but to give you an idea, like from block to block, that's a nautical mile. All of these images would cover at least a couple of nautical miles. So these are big aggregations. The red, some of the bottoms are marked, but the red, even the densest part of the red here, that's all cod. And it's so thick, as you can see in this top. We did an ROV actually on this site. These fish are literally tight together at certain times of the year. So highly, highly aggregated. Now this is in the winter. Winter time is the time of highest aggregation. Of course, it's no secret that back in the day when the trawlers, and I'll go into this in a minute, but when the trawlers found the overwintering spawning aggregations of cod, they were sitting ducks. And you know, the catch rates were high, and you can see why. It's quite obvious when you actually see how these fish behave. Now I wanted to bring this one up, just for a bit of fun, if nothing else, is that this is an image just taken with a little camera off a wharf in Newfoundland. And you can see the cod. And we go back to 1497 when Cabot claims that he could fish with baskets. And I'm not really sure about his choice of gear, but I think I could probably fish with baskets. And this is now. I mean, this is with the stock in a depressed state. And all those other images as well were from, you know, very recently. They're not when we had millions of tons, when you might expect. This is behavior, and this is the way these fish behave. And it doesn't. There may be a sort of lower limit where they change their behavior. I think there may be, but certainly at this stage, this is the way they behave. And again, it's very important when we talk about fisheries on them. Now, these are all kind of good, positive things about the northern cod stock. Super abundant, highly aggregated, and so on. But it's not all positive with this stock. And this picture attempts to show that. This is a cold water northern stock. The growth rates are actually low. The bottom, this is relative size of 4-year-olds in these different systems. And you can see the Irish Sea has these monsters at 4, and it sort of comes down the line. The northern cod are just, they grow slower. It's as simple as that. They're one of the slowest growing stocks. Again, very important in terms of productivity and how we might harvest these stocks sustainably. Now, it isn't that they never get big. Don't think that. They certainly do. It's just that it takes them a lot longer. So, a 4-year-old cod in the Irish Sea, it might take a cod off Labrador 15 or 20 years to attain that same, because they keep growing over their life. So if we don't catch them, or they don't, they're not dead from some other reason, they will get super large, and that was always the case historically. This is an old picture from the early 1900s of 2 girls off Labrador showing off probably their father's trophy catch, I don't know. Big cod. Anyway. Now in this next slide, I've tried to summarize some kind of recent comparisons that I've made with colleagues. This is actually in a book which we've done, which is now in press. But what this basically shows is a comparison of the northern cod, the Icelandic cod, and the northeast Arctic cod. These are the 3 big cod stocks in the world. There's only 3 really big ones. They're all large, they're all migratory, they all depend on Kaitlyn to a varying extent. But they're similar in many different ways. But you can see, if you can see the small letters in the years, if you go back to the 60s, and this is basically when reliable data on this start, they were all in the millions of tons. Now it's arguable, the Norwegians will argue their stock, mine's bigger than yours kind of deal, but it doesn't really matter. They were all very large in the millions of tons. But you can see what happened over time. The dotted line is us, that's the northern cod. All of them came down through that period of the 50s to the 70s as almost, you can probably say almost entirely because of just overharvesting, overfishing, drove that down. But what happened after that is very different to these stocks. The northeast Arctic cod at the top is now booming. The Icelandic stock is doing pretty well, certainly as well as average, and the northern cod is still struggling. We'll see there have been changes in recent years. Now, why would that be? Well, if you look at overall production from the stock, now this is just from a simple production model, nothing complicated here. You can see that historically production from the northern cod was pretty high, but it depended on having that high biomass. That's what really drove it. When it came down, productivity went down very, very quickly in that stock. And the production per biomass, if you look at that, it kind of wobbles around a lot, and some of that may be real and some of it might be just because of the poor data. But there's one, I think, point in that, is that the northern cod, on average, is probably only about half the production per biomass that these other 2 stocks have. Now this is incredibly important because that's the basis of our fisheries, that productivity. So I'm going to just leave that for now, but I think this is one of the most important things that we have to learn about some of these stocks, is just how productive they are. They're not all the same. I don't know this for sure, but I think historically, and I go back a fair number of years with this stock. I may be one of the last living people who actually experienced a lot of this. I don't think people years ago, at least, had any appreciation of this. They in just simple language, they thought, well, look, these Norwegians and Icelanders, look at them. They're harvesting at this high rate. Why can't we? We should be able to do the same. Well, no. It doesn't always work that way. It doesn't matter about the high biomass. And in simple talk, what I've tried to tell fishermen is, look, If we want to harvest the same amount of fish as Iceland, we have to have twice the biomass that they have. That's, you know, a simple expression of that, that fishermen understand right away. Okay, now, just a little bit about the, again, I'm going to have to skip over this really fast, but the importance of the biology. One of the things about this stock that is key is its this simple food chain and its dependence on capelin. Extremely important. 2J3KL, that's the northern cod. The others are the two other big areas. Well, 3L is actually part of that in that graph. But 3NO is the southern Grand Bank, but they're heavily, heavily dependent on capelin. So the condition of that pelagic forage fish, if you want to call it that, is really, really important to the productivity in this stock. It has to be. The estimates historically are 50 to 60% of the annual energy budget would come from that single prey. All right, enough about that. Let's talk about the fisheries. These fisheries have been going on for a long time, 500 years. Now, the First Nations of Newfoundland and Labrador were seafaring people, but they had such an abundance of salmon and seals and caribou, which were their main sources of sustenance, not to mention the vegetable matter, because there are, you know, tons of berries and all the rest of it. But they are hunter-gatherers, and they didn't really mess with cod at all. Birds' eggs were another big thing. They like to go to the many seabird colonies and do that. But cod wasn't, there's no real evidence. This has been researched a lot by people that have studied this in detail. There wasn't really any evidence of it until about 500 years ago. Now, who actually found this? It came from Europe, perhaps Basques, fishermen. The French were highly involved in it, trying to capture what the overall harvests of cod from the Newfoundland systems. Now, this includes the northern cod and also the smaller stocks around it. But this kind of gives you way back to 1500. Now, of course, as you get back further back in time, the more, this is probably not right. You get a lot of these ups and downs are probably just, you know, lack of really good data. But it is remarkable how good the data is. It has issues, of course, because this is exports and landings. You don't know anything about, you know, what was really caught. But it's probably a pretty good index of what was going on. And we can divide that fishery just quickly into some chronological periods. For 250 years or so, it was a seasonal migratory fishery. People came from Europe, they fished, they went home. There were stages left in certain places and sometimes caretakers, but settlement was actually discouraged or outlawed. It was, as has been referred to, a big fishing ship in the middle of the ocean. That's what Newfoundland was. So that went on for a long time. And, you know, the catches, if this is at all right, we're you know, probably about 100,000 tons a year we're taking back to Europe. Settlement started in the early 1800s, first by the English, and then big incursion of Irish. There were always some French there, but they didn't stay long in most places, and the English and the French were always fighting anyway, so, you know, that went on forever. And that went on until the 20th century, really, over the fishery. But you can see what happened during that time. A long period of time, settlement went up, catches went up. There were some periods in there where people thought there was a crisis in the fishery, bad years and so on. But overall, it looked like it was fairly sustainable over all that time. Right up until, you know, 1950. And about that time, without putting specific years on it, this is post-World War II now, and I think everybody probably knows what happened. European nations and the former Soviet Union in particular were starved for protein. They thought, you know, the ocean was the place, they were going to get it, and they wanted to come to Newfoundland. And there was a lot of political hokey-pokery going on at that time. What I remember best about this era is, unfortunately, nothing. In 1968, I was an undergraduate at the University of Guelph studying fisheries management. And I distinctly remember never having this mentioned, even though it was going on. The biggest rate of destruction of fisheries that probably had ever taken place was going on right in our backyard, and it was never mentioned. So that shocks me to this day. But anyway, we knew a lot about trout and stuff, but you know, it just wasn't on people's radar. And I'm not sure why. You know, whether people just thought that it didn't really make any difference, or whether politics just trumped everything, I don't know. Anyway, that went on, but as you can see from the span of this, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to show this, it didn't last long. You know, this kind of poor fishing behavior can have devastating effects very quickly. It doesn't take long to screw it up. And that's what happened. And then after that time, you know, we had a little bit of a rebound, but then unfortunately Canada thought they would try to mimic what the Europeans and Soviets had done. You know, think about this for a minute. For all these years, this was a seasonal fishery. It was only possible in the summer and early fall when the conditions were there. All the rest of the year, which is the overwintering and spawning time, those times I showed of high aggregation, was basically a protected time. There was no fishery. That all changed with this year-round fishing, and then we started in the same way with pretty well the same results. Now I wanted to, just a point of interest if nothing else, because I've got a personal connection to this, I wanted to something about the resident fishery from 1800 to 1850. 150 years, cod landings were more or less sustainable. You know, you can argue this, but 200 to 400,000 tons per year. Harvest rates, though, if we're right about how much biomass was there, they were low. You know, most years it was probably less than 10%. Some years 15%. Apparently sustainable through all of this long period of time. And a lot of people have thought, oh, well, there wasn't any management back then. That's not true at all. You know, you went through a whole period where, you know, I call it birth control, because all of the fishing areas, when the traps came in the late 1800s, every trap has to have a berth. And every trap is made exactly for that berth. It can't go anywhere else. This is just the physical design of the gear. And there's only certain places along the coast that are good berths. And that was known, and in every community, they would either be auctioned off or they'd be owned by families. That was variable from the places. But there was no piling on of fishing effort. It was actually very carefully controlled. Interestingly enough, when I was doing my PhD at McGill, I guess I must have learned something. But when I was doing my PhD at McGill, I did it on the Labrador Fisheries, because that's what my interest was. And I had a family connection back to this. So I got this old map from the 1800s of the fishing berths that were there. This is in the Strait of Belle Isle, the Labrador Strait fishery. And in the 80s at least, or up until the moratorium, those exact same berths were still being fished. You know, it hadn't changed at all. So that gives you an idea that there was some form of indirect management. And the fact that it was seasonal was a big, big part of indirect management. And then the other big thing that happened during this time is the seal fishery became an economic necessity. Now, I'm not going to go in much about seals. We can talk about it later, but seals are a big issue. And we've got this super abundant population now, and we have to deal with the animal rights people and with the Americans that don't want any part of this, and the Europeans don't want any part of this, and all the rest of it. But anyway, that's another issue. So to summarize this, what happened up until 1992, anyway, this shows the landings. Now this is just for northern cod now, not all of the stocks. For all of the stocks, the peak was well over 1 million tons, probably 1.5 million. But anyway, it was 800,000 or so for the northern cod. And this is the big thing in here, which didn't last long. I mean, look at this. We're talking about hundreds of years of fisheries. This one didn't last 15. I mean, it's just a shot in the pan. It just shows you how wrong things can go very quickly with just improper methods. So here we have this input of the foreign fisheries, and we see a decline in the Newfoundland inshore fishery that happened. So it went down, well, to probably a third of what it was. I remember Art May, who was, he was the president of Memorial, and before he died, he was a good friend of mine for a while, anyway. He told me that when he was doing his PhD research off Labrador in the 60s, that is, when all this was going on, well, he described it that it was a city of lights, of trawlers and motherships and all the rest, just sitting over the overwintering and spawning grounds. And I think in my first book about cod, I quoted him in a couple of places from stuff he'd written way back in the 60s. Because people were arguing, you know, this is different fish. You got these inshore fish, you know, that's what these local yokels fish. They fish these inshore fish. But you know, we're the big trawlers and we're out here on the grounds, and it's a different fish. And Art just said, categorically said, look, it's the same fish, you know, just at different times of year migrating in and out. And of course he was absolutely right. And what happened was, when, you know, as this started depleting the stocks, the inshore catches went way down. And then, you know, the end of this story is basically the Canadian policy and the Canadian fleet trying to mimic this here, and we had a very quick downturn. Now, there's all kinds of other things that were going on during this period that have been well researched and published. There were drops in productivity and all the rest of it that compounded the overfishing. And no time to get into the details about that, but we can discuss it if you want. So I want to get in. This is probably the most. I like to give this history because it helps people understand, you know, what the context of all of this is. But the last 25 years are certainly interesting, if nothing else. They've been heartbreaking for a lot of people, and you know, as one of the only one kind of scientists who kind of had to live through all of this, it wasn't easy at times for anybody. And watching your communities die and all the rest of it right in front of your eyes that you've been attached to for most of your life, it's just not an easy thing to go through. But nevertheless, we had to do it. And this is the period. This is from DFO survey data, but if you wanted to forget these high peaks, because that's just survey noise. It's not real. And I don't want to get into what happened with that 1986, that really high one. That was just crap, you know, to put it run. Nobody's been able to explain how they got that number to this day, but it certainly was not right, and it led a lot of management astray. And you know, I think I'm going to end this talk with a little bit about leading management astray. You know, we can't be doing this, because you know, management will act, and the fisheries will be affected by that. But if you want to think of about 1 million tons as an index, if you don't want to think of it as an absolute number, because it comes from a survey. And then this rapid decline in the early 90s, and then through all of this period up until about 2007, and I want to talk about that period first, flatline. Low productivity, very poor recruitment, very poor growth, just nothing good happening with cod. And you know, everybody is in agreement about that. There were all kinds of different views on this, different surveys, different types of things, information from fishermen, and so on. Lots of agreement. And you know, that's not always possible in fisheries. We have a situation right now where there's no agreement, and I'll get into that in a minute, and that's happened in the past. And one of the major things that happened in this time, now this background map is from something that I published, oh geez, it must be 25 years ago. But it was on the movement patterns of the cod stock of the 3 different regions of the cod stock, from the Hawk Channel in the north and Bonavista Corridor in the south, and their supposed migratory patterns. But what happened in the early 90s is that everything kind of coalesced into this Bonavista Corridor area, the area that's highlighted, and there were very few fish. There were some. They were never completely gone to the north. Don't get that idea. There were always fish there, but at a much, much, much reduced level. And the surveys that were done sometimes had trouble even finding them. So that's one thing that happened in the ecosystem. You had this shift, and that happened in Kaitlyn and cod, 2 very important species. And we got to mention Kaitlyn a little bit more here of what happened during that period between 1990 and 2007, because Kaitlyn collapsed as well. Now, this shows there are actually more data than this, because this is the Canadian survey. But there's a Russian survey that used to, because they fished Kaitlyn in the early days. They don't, well, they might again, but there's not enough there to fish right now, so they don't bother. But, you know, their data actually agrees with this quite well. And you can see a decline, and again, pretty well flatlined. And it only started around 2007. This, right in here, we saw some increase, and then up until 2015, it looked like things were on the upswing. Things were happening. And in addition to that, in addition to this sort of decline in the apparent abundance, they just collapsed. Their size collapsed. So you had Kaitlyn that were normally 18, 20 centimeters long. They were down to 10. They were down to half that size. Really small. So you think about, how important these fish are to a predator. If I'm a cod and I got to, put out a certain amount of energy to catch one Kaitlyn, if I get a 20 centimeter, I've done a lot better than if I get one that's 10. And yet I've probably got to put out the same amount of energy to do that. Same with seabirds, same with whales. All of these things in that system depend on Kaitlyn. Pretty well everything. So this is something, it's never really been well explained. We've done some research on it. It looks like a bottom-up thing. There are other people that have, in Newfoundland, that have done research on this, and it looks like some bottom-up thing happened. There was certainly a distribution shift down to the southern waters. But what the exact details of that are still probably will be debated for some time to come. And there was even a recent paper put out by Ken Frank and some colleagues at Bedford Institute that tried to argue that Kaitlyn didn't collapse. But I think this is just dead wrong. And there's actually a paper now being written by people in Newfoundland to rebut this, because it really is. My opinion when I wrote that paper, I hate to be too strong about it, but just to put a bit of fun into it, I think if they use the same methods to describe cod, they conclude northern cod didn't decline either. I'll just have to go through this very quickly. But shrimp just went way up. The landings went way up, and there was no really good abundance or biomass estimates back here, so it's really hard to say exactly that it was an increase in abundance like that, but it probably was. Certainly fishermen will tell you that. And that happened, and also, and the other thing, the snow crab, same thing. And those fisheries really saved the day for Newfoundland and Labrador for all that period of time. Very lucrative fisheries, not as many people involved in it, so that not everybody was a winner, but a lot of people were real winners from this. In fact, a lot of the really hardcore crab fishermen don't want cod to come back, but they're going to have no choice because, you know, the crab and shrimp now are declining as quickly as they came up. Now, during all that time, I want to get back to cod now. We're in the 90s still, trying to do this chronologically. We have this curious tale of Smith Sound. Smith Sound is a fjord off Trinity Bay. It's got a star on it there. Beautiful place, beautiful little fjord off Trinity Bay. It just sits inside of the Bonavista Corridor, which was the place where the cod went down. That's where they made their last stand. The last big schools were there in the early 90s. And in 1995, in the spring of 1995, I'll never forget this. I was still with DFO at the time, and I was there in the Northwest Hills. And it was Chris Taggart. I don't know if you know any Chris. He's at Dalhousie now. Taggart came running in to me, and he grabbed me, literally grabbed me by the neck, and said, "You got to come right now." You know, and I said, "What the hell are you? You know, what are you talking about?" He said, "We were just in Smith Sound looking to try to find a few herring and stuff, and there's a huge amount of cod in there, or we think it is." You know, because he didn't really know. So he said, "You got to bring," because I was the guy who did the surveys of cod, and in the inshore and the offshore, but using hydroacoustics, which is the only way you can do it in the inshore. Trawl surveys, it's not on. So we went out, and you know, it was about 10,000 tons of cod of spawning age, and you know, we wondered where did they come from? Because this Smith Sound was not a historic fishing place. In fact, it was a lumber area, and the few fishing families that lived in that area, and I know most of them personally, they went to fish off Labrador because there was no fish in Smith Sound. But all of a sudden, here it was, you know, right out of the blue. It reminded me of the herring in Norway. I had the privilege, I guess, to be on the maiden voyage of the old Johan Hjort when he did the acoustic survey of the herring inside the Fulton there in 1992. And, you know, and that was the time when the herring were all in this fjord. And, you know, it was great going across some great big schools and all the rest of it. And I asked the Norwegian biologist at the time, well, because the herring was closed, there was nothing going. They said, well, we're just going to wait. You know, eventually these fish will reestablish things, and damn it, they did. You know, so now you've got, you know, a huge stock and big fishery and all the rest. It reminded me very much of Smith Sound. And the other thing that it did, which was just my own kind of personal thing, is it was like a research laboratory. Here was a place where all these cod were. Literally, you could leave from a wharf in a very small boat. You could be over top of them in 5 minutes. And you know, just provided opportunities for graduate students and so on to study cod in an environment that was possible, because you could never done this in the offshore areas. So you know, these are aggregations of cod, and sometimes this would go on, and this is across the fjord. This would go on for like 10 miles. There'd be this long sweep. That's just one slice through it. And that up there in the top corner, and that's an ROV video, which took a lot of work to get, but showing the fish way up. They're 100 meters off the bottom, and in these columns where we're not sure exactly what they're doing, but it's something to do with spawning. It only occurs during spawning time. Now, what happened next? Well, the Smith Sound cod was the biggest overwintering spawning aggregation. Inshore, there was nothing offshore like this during all that time. And all those bad things that I said about the cod offshore, none applied to Smith Sound. There was no unusual, they were huge, you had great big fish, the growth rates were strong, everything was good. So, you know, we wondered about this. They reached well over 25,000 tons. They grew over those years in the early 2000s. And then, around 2005, 2006, they just started to disappear. They just weren't there anymore. You know, you would go out on your survey. I mean, we were surveying these things, I think in a couple of years we surveyed them about 30 times in a year. You know, we were trying to track the whole around the year thing. And they just went down, and you know, by 2009, or 2008 actually, there were almost none, like 2009, almost none. And at the same time, these are from the surveys that we were doing just offshore in the adjacent Bonavista corridor. Things were coming up like this at the same time. So in a paper in 2011, we asked the question, after, that was a summary paper for a lot of the work that went on in Smith Sound, were these two things linked? And there were a number of things that kind of suggested they were, but a lot of people didn't want to believe it. Geneticists had everybody convinced that these fish were totally separate in the inshore and offshore, and the management has actually been based on that, because they opened an inshore fishery thinking it wasn't really connected to the other things. So, you know, these things have importance. So, and Noel Cadigan actually in an early model, I just asked him, why don't you put the Smith Sound cod into the model and see if it helps? Because the fit was lousy. And it really did help. You know, it explained a lot of the unexplainable things when it wasn't in there. But that was all indirect evidence. So I had a graduate student work on otolith chemical signatures. And without going into the detail, this is all a mess, but just look at that red one up in the top corner. The hypothesis was that if the Smith Sound cod and the cod in the Bonavista corridor were, in fact, the same fish, they should have the same oxygen chemical signatures in their otoliths, because that is representative habitat. And they did. So we're pretty well convinced now that these were the same fish, that that's where the Smith Sound cod came from, and that's where they went to. Now this is probably the most interesting part, rebuilding, 2007 to 2015. Everything looked good during this period. Waters were generally warming from the cold. Smith Sound cod had dispersed. We were convinced, not everybody was, but we were convinced they'd gone off and kind of kick-started things in the immediate offshore area where they were increasing. Kaitlyn was coming up. Shrimp and crab were declining, not that that was a good thing, but it was happening. And the offshore cod were increasing at about almost 30% a year on average during this. So this was remarkable given the flat land. And at the time, well, way back since 1990, I'd been doing these offshore spring surveys to try to capture the spawning distribution and abundance. Not every year we were able to do them, but since 1990 we've been doing them. And fortunately enough, in 2012 we got funding from the province to really go at these surveys in detail, and that's what we did. So that's just a representative survey tract to cover the main areas where we expected to find them in the spring. And in the first years, they were pretty well all in the Bonavista corridor, all of the fish. There was very little activity to the north. Now, just out of interest, this is what we're looking for. These are highly aggregated. This is all cod, 100%. 1990 shows way back when. This is when we first studied the migration. Each one of those blocks is a nautical mile, and that's part of a school, a migrating school that covered about 20 nautical miles. I mean, this was huge. And that's kind of what it looked like on an echo sounder, way up in the water, moving along. And we saw nothing like that between say 1992 was the last time, and 2008. You could not find an aggregation like that. You'd find cod, yes, here, there, and everywhere, but nothing that looked like they meant business, basically, because they're aggregated for a reason. They're setting up for spawning, and we couldn't find it. 2008 was the first year that we found it, and it was all in the Bonavista corridor. That's just an example. These bottom two are from 15, so that's quite a bit later. But you know, this is basically how they look on acoustic images anyway during that time of year. So we put this together this is going to the paper we did in 2015, and you can see the top panel basically describes the biomass in the Bonavista corridor coming down, from near 1 million tons and down to squat for all that period, and then rising up quite quickly. And I put the DFO estimates of spawning stock biomass on there as well. They were in good agreement, quite good agreement, considering totally independently done and with no overlap in anything, and different times and all the rest of it. So it all looked good. Kaitlyn showed that same pattern coming up, and temperatures were increasing. So all looked good up until 2015. And in addition, the size was great. Now this is from tagging data, which and these acoustic research surveys that I've been doing for a long time, and before that. So this is back in the 80s, what the size distribution looked like in the Bonavista corridor, and then you can see as time goes on, working up, it went right down, no large fish at all. And then in 2015, both in the south and in the right, which is the northern, where the red star is, a much greater size distribution. So things have definitely changed considerably during that time. So this all looked good too. A kind of interesting ecological question, and we think has application to all rebuilding stocks, is whether this was redistribution or just local growth. So we looked at a number of different things, and this shows details of 3 surveys where we had managed to cover parts at least of all of this latitudinal area. And the top panel shows the dense cod aggregations that were in the one place in the Bonavista corridor in 2008. That's the top panel. There were some fish to the north, but very, very little. By 2013, you can see that this is dispersed a little bit in the southern area, and there's more fish showing further north. But by 2015, actually there's fewer fish here and lots of fish up there, and that's captured in that that graph on the right, where you can see in 2008 on the left, they're all in that one area, and then it starts up, and then now there's actually as many fish in the north as in the south. So we thought at this point that this is probably a distributional shift. So we looked at the survey data, and this is from the red dots are from the Bonavista corridor from 2007 up. And you can see that it is rising and rising until 2015. It takes a plummet. It comes right down. So the number of fish that we could survey in the Bonavista corridor went actually way down by a lot. But if you take all of the fish that we surveyed, that is the northern fish, it actually fits that simple model really well. And we thought this was evidence again that this is redistribution, that these fish in the south have simply gone back north, which was a good thing, because northern spawning is what has always driven this stock, and we don't think that you will get high productivity, high recruitment, in other words, in this stock until that northern spawning is filled. And another line of evidence came from growth. So these are just von Bertalanffy curves, but what you can see is that the northern fish historically were always small. Their growth was lower, just simple as that. And there's reams of literature on this, coming right up to 2014. So you can see the north curve up to 2000, and then the north in 2015. They're right up there. The southern one doesn't change. It's about the same as it always was. Maybe a bit better, but not a huge amount. But the north group looks just like the south group. So again, it's evidence that redistribution of those southern fish. So that kind of just symbolizes it, what we think happened. Now I want to get into the real tricky part. Since 2015, a new stock assessment model was brought in. It was a a state-space model, which I have only a limited understanding of. Admittedly, I'm trying to learn, but I consider myself a novice on this. Anyway, it was introduced by a colleague, Noel Cadigan, in 2016, and it was used. And the result of this, and I'll get into this in a sec, is industry pressure to increase cod fishing with effort-based management. You'll see what I mean in a second. Now, I can't tell you all of the details that are known right now because the 2018 assessment has not been released publicly, will be shortly, and the minister hasn't made his decision, but I'll tell you what I can. So this is the case as of the assessment in 2016. This is from the survey. So you can see up to 2015, it looks more or less like the other figures that I showed you from the spawning surveys. Looks good. Everything marching up at a good rate. And this is the model output, which also, pretty well duplicates it, but looks pretty good. And, everybody was kind of happy with that. But then, some things came around that did not make some of us too happy. This model, for the first time with this stock, I'm not sure, Carl might know better, first time with this stock anyway that it's been tried to do, use tagging data to try to disaggregate F, fishing mortality, from M, from natural mortality. And while no one really at that time, we've learned a little bit since then, because of the first years, really knew what the hell this model was doing. It was kind of a black box to the assessment. The results that came out of it just kind of floored some of us in this respect, because if you look at this is over here on the right, this is the average M, natural mortality, going back to 83. And what it shows, and that's the F over there, but if you look at the scales of these, it shows that natural mortality is basically an order of magnitude above fishing mortality, even back in the time when it was all generally accepted by everyone. No matter what argument you took or what, everybody had a different view, but everybody agreed that fishing was the prime driver of that. This says exactly the opposite. So we wondered, how can this be right? So this is going back a couple of years now, and that's the thing. And then it got worse, because this is what DFO reported, and what it basically says. If you just look at the top of that table, risk of spawning stock biomass declining below the 2015. Why they chose 2015, I don't know, but whatever. But what it basically says is you can multiply the catch by a factor of 5 with no impact on anything. That's what it says. And that's basically what management did. Well, they didn't do it by 5, but they did by 3. So, these things that we do have implications. It's not, you can sit back, and we all do this, you can sit back and have an academic argument about, this model, that model, blah, 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 this and that. But, the rubber hits the road when it really impacts management. It affects people's lives. This affects tens of thousands of people when this is done. And there was another reason as well, is that we saw, I say we because myself and a couple of colleagues in particular, but others as well, clouds on the horizon for the stock. It had been growing really nice. Great, everybody agreed. But, face it, cod was still in the critical zone by anybody's. No matter whose B-lim you want or, who you're going to listen to, it was still in the critical zone. Kaitlyn were declining again. That is, from that nice increase, they're going down. Shrimp, the other important food, was down to low levels and waters were cooling. All of these things, ecologically, even though you might not be able to quantify them as well as we'd like, they're all not good for the northern cod. So that was equal concern. So we thought, please don't increase fishing at this time. And myself and one colleague back at Memorial felt so strongly that we wrote a letter to Nature, and this came out last year, over a year ago. And this is only the start of it, but basically what we were saying is, please don't increase the fishing pressure on this stock at this time. Did that have any impact? Well, no. You know, the minister went ahead anyway, and based on the science, and you know, what does he know? I mean, he's just going to listen to the fact that, and in some industries we're arguing that it didn't matter. So what actually happened? Well, there was no stock assessment in 17, there was just an update, but it again carried on optimistically. In 2018, spawning stock biomass is down by 30%. We lost 100,000 tons, according to the outputs of the model. Now this may be right or wrong, it may be 50 or maybe whatever, but it's a loss. Everybody agrees to that. And again, the losses are attributed to natural mortality, not fishing. Quite a dangerous thing. And industry is using this, as we speak, to justify keeping fishing on. And I won't go, this is just another plot, this is just an updated plot from the 2018 assessment. Same one as 2016 with another year or two added on, but it says the same thing. And there's a couple of other things, but I'm just going to skip over this. There's some stuff with the tagging data in there that I just don't understand. If you take exploitation rates from the tagging, it indicates removals of like 35,000 tons, not 13 or whatever they have. So there's clearly a lot of questions. Now, I don't want to be too critical of the stock assessment people. They're doing what they're doing. But there's just a lot of questions around this. But my main concern is the implications of it. And to be fair to the DFO people, this is their final advice. And it was the same in 2016. Removals from all source must be kept at the lowest possible level. Okay, now that's fair enough. The problem is, they don't determine what the lowest possible level is. That's determined by the politicians. Their lowest possible level is way too high. So that's it. So anyway, feeling frustrated again by all of this, we wrote another letter that is just come out, and this probably won't make any difference anyway, but at least we get it off our chest. You know, somebody's got to say something at the time, because the last thing you want to happen is, if this really does go south, and it might with improper management again, you don't want people to say, well, nobody said anything at the time. Well, somebody said something anyway. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think I've used up all my time or more anyway. I welcome talking to any of you about this, or ideas that you might have about what's going on.